Hello, everyone. Today we're diving into one of the most destructive and complicated wars in European history, the 30 Years' War. It's messy and it's long. But don't worry, we'll break it all down phase by phase and point out the most important parts. So, the 30 Years' War lasts from 1618 to 1648, and it's usually divided into four key phases. So, the Bohemian phase, the Danish phase, the Swedish phase, and the French phase. Each phase tells us something different about how the war evolved from a religious conflict to a full on political power struggle. This war mainly takes place in the Holy Roman Empire, so think modern day Germany. Early on, it's Catholic versus Protestant, but by the end, it's more about power, specifically trying to check the growing dominance of the Catholic Habsburgs. And it all ends with the Peace of Westphalia, a key moment in AP Euro because it changes how we think about sovereignty and diplomacy in Europe. So, back in 1555, the Peace of Augsburg let rulers decide their territory's religion, and that lasted for about 60 years. Then the Habsburgs, specifically Ferdinand II, start pushing back. He's a hardcore Catholic and wants to crush Protestantism in general. So, when he becomes emperor in 1619, the stage is set for conflict. And this sets us up for the first stage, the Bohemian stage. So Ferdinand II inherits Bohemia and becomes the Holy Roman Emperor. And he sends some officials to Prague to discuss this Protestant problem they're having. And what ends up happening is it's literally wild. This is the famous defenestration of Prague. So they literally threw those Catholic messengers out of a window, like a window in a building. And it sparks this revolt in Bohemia against Catholic rule. They did not like what they had to say. So, to lead this revolt, the Protestants are going to elect this guy named Frederick the Fifth, and they elect him as the leader of Bohemia. And he leads this Calvinist army to fight against the Holy Roman Emperor, Frederick II. And it does not go well. They do not win that fight. And it's going to wipe out Protestantism in Bohemia. But the important thing to take away is that the Bohemian phase, while it's mostly religious in nature and ends with a solid win for the Catholic forces, does inspire others to push back as well. Which then leads us to the Danish phase. So the Dutch are being led at this point by a Protestant king in Denmark called Christian IV, who is expanding his power and territory, trying to branch into the Holy Roman Empire, which, as you can imagine, does not go well for him. But this interesting fact is that England, the Dutch, and France do not intervene right away. They want to watch this play out, which is interesting considering the whole balance of power dynamic that's going to go on a little bit later in the century. So Ferdinand II decides this really just cannot stand. I need to end all resistance. And he tries to crush Protestantism throughout the whole of the Holy Roman Empire. And he sends this guy named Albrecht von Wallenstein to lead the army against the Protestants. And they are going to be absolutely brutal. They'll pillage towns, cause general chaos, and ultimately really squash a lot of Protestant communities. And the ultimate result of this phase is the Edict of Restitution in 1629. So this is kind of the treaty that they all have to sign, saying that the Catholics win, the Holy Roman Empire wins, and it restores all Catholic land lost since 1552 and deprives all Protestants, except Lutherans, of their basic rights as citizens. And this is going to be a big deal. People are going to freak out over this, even moderate Protestants and Catholics. And Ferdinand starts to lose a lot of support. So he tries to kind of squash this and he fires Wallenstein, also because he's kind of worried that he's getting too powerful. But he kind of goes back on some of these reforms. So here's a look at some of that land that the Holy Roman Empire is going to get back from that specific treaty after Denmark loses. Which then brings us to stage three, the Swedish phase. Okay, so now Sweden's entering this war, led by Gustavus Adolphus, one of the greatest military minds of the time. Now you might be thinking to yourself, I see France and Sweden are in there together. Why is that? Well, Sweden is Protestant, France is Catholic, but France starts secretly funding them in this war because France also wants to weaken the Catholic Habsburgs. This is the phase where the war becomes more about politics and less about religion. Um, we see that Ferdinand II still clings to power, but his hold is starting to become weaker and weaker, especially when Wallenstein is assassinated by Frederick II, who had turned on him to take power for himself. A lot of high drama going on at this point in the storyline. Make a great HBO miniseries. But here's a map that shows kind of where everybody stands at this point in the war, like who's dependent on Sweden, allied with Sweden, who's in league with the Holy Roman Empire. So Sweden loses their part of the war, which then, of course, naturally brings in their secret ally, France. And France is now actually going to have to start physically fighting in this war. And now that France is here, we're in a full blown European conflict. Basically, every major power is involved, and the destruction is really horrific. Um, this is the most destructive part of the whole 30 Years' War. We see agriculture is starting to collapse. There's a famine that's going on, um, mass death, disease. Germany's population drops by a third. There are cities being burned to the ground. There's massive inflation. It's just really overall a very unstable time for Europe. And just when people think kind of like this is never going to end, after 30 years, the Peace of Westphalia is signed in 1648. This treaty is going to be one of the most important treaties in European history overall. So here's what it does. It ends the dominance of the Holy Roman Emperor. Over 300 German principalities are going to gain independence from this. France is going to get the territory of Alsace. Sweden and the Netherlands gain territory or independence, and Swiss independence is finally recognized. The other big thing is that religiously, Calvinism is officially recognized, and rulers can still pick their state's religion, but must allow private worship, which is going to be huge. So this map here will show you the change of territory because of this treaty. You see all the different kind of strongholds in the Holy Roman Empire are starting to get broken up into, different territories owned by other countries. So here are some of our long-term effects of the 30 Years' War. We see that Northern Germany remains mostly Protestant, Southern Germany remains mostly Catholic. But one of the biggest things we see is that it basically this ends major religious wars in Europe, and it begins the rise of secular diplomacy and a more modern state system. We see that France comes out of this as the most powerful nation state in Europe during this time. And then we also see that the Holy Roman Empire is finally kind of lost. They are not going to rise to the status that they had, and they're pretty economically devastated. We also see that this is a major turning point. We're going to see that Europe is no longer a religiously fragmented continent, and they're more focused on developing nation states and what will be called kind of, we'll talk more about it later, but the balance of power in politics. And that's really the end of the 30 Years' War video. What started as a religious war kind of ends up a political one. But that's the end. Thanks for watching.